Now, you've written a book entitled How Nations Escape Poverty, Vietnam, Poland, and the Origins of Prosperity. So what's the secret to escaping poverty?
I start in my first chapter with Adam Smith's work, The Wealth of Nations. And what he said is the only way to escape poverty is economic growth. And the most important precondition for economic growth is economic freedom. And you can see it with Poland and Vietnam that this is absolutely correct. I give you two examples. Vietnam was in the 90s the poorest country in the world, poorer than all African countries. First, they had the war with the United States, also with France, with Japan, with China. And what was not destroyed by the war was destroyed by the planned economy. But then they understood, okay, planned economy does not work, and they implemented private property, started free market reforms, and the result is that the number of people living in poverty decreased from 80% in 1990 to less than 5% today, from 80% to less than 5%. The other example is Poland. Poland was, even in the 80s, one of the poorest countries in Europe, poorer than the Ukraine, for example. Then they started in 1990 with capitalist reforms. Balcerowicz, who thinks very similar to Javier Milei in Argentina today, he started with his reforms, opened the economy, and the result is that now, since 3 decades, Poland is Europe's growth champion. For example, compare Germany, my country, where we now go more and more in the direction of a planned economy. Our prediction, the OECD prediction for growth rate in Germany is 0.1% for this year, 0.1. For Poland, it's 2.8%. So, and you see with these examples in my book that the only way for a country to escape poverty is capitalism and not development aid and not redistribution.
Okay, that's very interesting. So why do you think, and I take it you believe that capitalism wins over socialism every time. Why is that so?
First of all, the most important question is not why, but to understand the fact. 200 years ago, 90% of the worldwide population lived in extreme poverty. Today, it's less than 9%. And all socialist experiments, without any exception, failed. There's not a single example where the standards of living increased. Why is that, your question? Ludwig von Mises, almost now exactly 100 years ago, predicted it all in his book, Why Socialism Cannot Work. Maybe it's a little bit too complicated to explain it here in detail, especially because they have no real prices, what is a big problem in socialism. And people are not motivated to work. I will give you one example from my book. In Vietnam, they had this collectivization of farmland. You know, the rural peasants, they owned only 5% of their land, but 95% was state-owned. But the result was that in the end, on this 5% of the land, they were more productive and had better results than at 95%, because it was their own self-interest. And this is what Adam Smith also wrote in his book, The Wealth of Nations, that it is your self-love or self-interest that makes you work hard. But in the end, it's not only you who has an advantage, but everyone, the whole society and the consumers. And this is what socialists don't understand. They believe in zero-sum thinking. What do I mean with this? They believe that the rich become only rich because they take it away from the poor. But this is not true. I give you one fact. In the beginning of the 80s, more than 40% of the worldwide population lived in extreme poverty. More than 40%. Today, I mentioned this, is less than 9%. At the same time, the number of billionaires increased. In 2000, we had 500 billionaires. Today, 2,800. If it would be true that people become only rich because they take it away from the poor, how can it happen that at the same time the number of billionaires increases while the number of people living in poverty decreases. The reason for both is the same. It's economic growth. You have economic growth. Vietnam is also another example. In socialist times, there was not a single billionaire. Now they have billionaires, even now a female billionaire. But in the same time, the people were lifted out of poverty. So this is the problem, that socialists don't understand it, as they believe in the zero-sum belief.
How do we harness that individual desire to do what someone wants to do? Someone is motivated, say, to become a builder, motivated to, say, become an artist, yet they look across the jobs markets and there's no jobs for builders or artists going on at the moment. How do we harness the individual's desire to work at what their self-interest, where their self-interest lies? How do we do that?
This is a good question. I mentioned that I've been at the Freedom Fest in Las Vegas last week, and I saw a great lecture from John Mackey. He's the founder of Whole Foods. Whole Foods, they have, I think, 500 shops all around the United States today. And he began with only one little shop, and together with his girlfriend, later it was sold for $17 billion to Amazon. So very successful. And he said one sentence that I kept in mind: it was all fun as long as not bureaucracy was involved. Then came the day when bureaucracy was involved, and this is always the problem. Instead of helping you to make a good job, they think all over the day with new laws, new regulations. We have it here in Germany. I tell you one stupid example. We were in Germany very proud for our automotive industry: Mercedes, BMW, Volkswagen. And now the European Commission, they decided to ban the registration of new cars with combustion engines by 2035. I think this never happened before, that a country voluntarily forbid its best product. The Chinese, of course, are very happy about it, because they are, for them, it's much easier to produce electric vehicles. They can export this now to Europe. And now we start with tariffs. This is what Mises called the spiral of intervention. Or they tell people in Germany now what heaters you should install in your house and what are forbidden. And, this is because politicians think that they are smarter than millions of consumers, than millions of entrepreneurs. I ask these politicians, if you're so smart, why don't you open your own company if you know better about it? Why do you go to politics if you think you know everything better? You don't know it better. It's, if the planned economy would be better than capitalism, then the Cold War would have been won by the Soviet Union, because they had this planned economy, and we go more and more in this direction. Of course, the difference is today they understood, the socialists, that it's not successful to nationalize all companies as they did in traditional socialism. But what they do, they reach the same goal with more and more taxes, regulations, more and more laws, and with this stupid policy of the Federal Reserve, of the central banks. So they don't have to nationalize as they did it in this old-fashioned way of socialism. So I speak about the modern kind of socialism that we have today. We go more and more in this direction.
And I'm currently talking with Rainer Zitelmann, and we're having a conversation about the challenges that really affect nations when choosing different types of economic ideologies, especially. Which nations on earth, Mr. Zitelmann, do you think would benefit from learning the lessons you have to teach?
I will mention especially one country, as I will go there next month. This is Argentina. In Argentina, 100 years ago, Argentina was one of the 3 or 4 wealthiest nations in the world, comparable to the United States. Then they started with all their crazy Peronist politics, and it went down, 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 down. And in the end, we had more than 40% of the people living in poverty. And since 1945, they had every single year double-digit inflation rate. Every year, with the exception of the 90s when it was linked to the dollar. So, and they have now a new president, Javier Milei, who calls himself anarcho-capitalist. And the interesting thing is that Javier Milei, by the way, he's a big fan of my book, The Power of Capitalism. I can recommend also this book. He said that he likes this book, The Power of Capitalism. So he believes also in capitalism and economic freedom. And it's the same, he believes in the same theories, like, for example, from Mises and Hayek, as Balcerowicz in Poland. I mentioned Balcerowicz was the finance minister who started capitalist reforms in Poland. But, and now this is the important lesson, and this is what I will tell people when I go to Argentina. When you start free market reforms, first of all, some things become worse. For example, hidden unemployment becomes open unemployment. And in Poland, it was the same. For 2 years, they had a decline in the GDP. So these things happened always. The same when Maggie Thatcher started their very, very successful economic reforms in the 80s. First, it became worse for 2 years, and then it became very, very good. And what I will tell the people in Argentina, if you are patient, if you understand that it's not possible to fix things in a couple of months that went wrong over decades and decades and decades, if you are patient, then Argentina will have a great future. I'm 100% convinced. But if you are not patient, if you go back to more government or to this crazy Peronist policies, then it will be a total disaster. And so I think Argentina is today the country where it's very important. But of course, there are also other countries. Let's speak about African countries. Leftist people believe that development aid is the best way to lift countries out of poverty. But that is a mistake. You can see if you compare Africa on the one hand and Asia on the other hand. Africa received much more development aid as Asia, but is still the poorest country, still the poorest continent in the world. The Asian countries, they did something different. They started even in China in the 80s with Deng Xiaoping, economic reforms, and in South Korea. I mentioned Vietnam, of course, also Singapore and a lot of other countries. So they escaped poverty. And what they could learn from Vietnam is another thing. These African countries, they blame always other countries like the Western world for their problems. Oh, we are so poor because of this colonialism and slavery. What is 50 or 100 years ago? And the Vietnamese people, they didn't blame the United States. When they were so poor, I mentioned this, that's in the 90s, they were the poorest country in the world. It would have been easy for people in Vietnam to blame the United States, because in the Vietnam War, 10 times more bombs and explosives from the United States fell on Vietnam than on Germany in the Second World War. Oh, and I mentioned this also, they did not have only war with the United States, also with China, Japan, and France. So it could be very easy for them to say, we are so poor, please give us development aid, it's all your fault. No, they understood it's our fault. We made this mistake with the planned economy. We have to implement economic reforms. And it's the same for an individual. If you want to change your life, for example, the first thing is you have to change your mindset. And if you blame other people, like a lot of people do today, I'm the victim of racism, of capitalism, of sexism, of whatever, yes, then you will never be successful. Stop blaming others. Take responsibility for your own life. And this is the same for individuals as it is for nations. And this is what a lot of countries could learn from Vietnam. Stop playing the Western world for your problems. The only really bad thing, do you know what's the only real bad thing that the Western world did to these countries? To export Marxism in these countries, because this caused a lot of problems. This is really their fault. Blame them for exporting Marxism in their countries.